Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about the United Nations, how it came about, what it is, and what its purpose is. The idea of a group of nations coming together to help govern one another and create a more global body first came about after World War I, but it didn't go particularly well with the League of Nations. World War I was obviously horrific. It dragged a bunch of countries into this international conflict, and a lot of lives were lost. After World War I, folks were hoping something like that would never happen again, and it did happen again with World War II, which was arguably a lot worse on the whole. And so in the middle of World War II, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China came together to sign a declaration to create a United Nations body. And in October of that same year, 1945, the United Nations Charter was ratified and the United Nations became a real thing. The United Nations Charter is incredibly long, as I would hope it would be for something of this scale. So we're just gonna go over some of the key points in why it was created and what it's meant to do, starting with the purpose. In the UN Charter, they lay out what the purpose, so the goals and the point of the United Nations is in 4 points. Part 1 is to maintain international peace and security, to take collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of peace, and to bring about, by peaceful means, and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. I've underlined some key words because this is a very long definition, impressively with no periods in it. You'll see international is here underlined quite a few times. It's important to remember that the purpose of the United Nations is international cooperation. International means between nations, so not one country on its own, but countries working together. And then you'll see the rest of it is about prevention and removal of threats. Suppression means to keep down, so suppression of acts of aggression means to keep down acts of aggression. And then finally, to bring about, through international law, the adjustment or settlement, so that means the change, or settlement means the solution of international disputes. All of this together means that the goal of the United Nations is to keep peace between different countries throughout the world. Purpose number 2 is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. Equal rights is underlined here as a concept we've seen in other videos, and self-determination is also underlined here as a key word. Self-determination is the idea that individual people have the opportunity to choose the direction of their life, as opposed to governments, religions, or other bodies. Purpose number 3 was to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. I also put in brackets here international problems of economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, as a part of building the United Nations was the recognition that in a more global world where people could talk to each other, where people could travel more freely because air travel existed, problems didn't just stay at home. A problem in one country could become a problem in another country very, very quickly, and the world wars really helped cement that. And finally, the 4th purpose of the United Nations was to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. I underlined harmonizing as a key word. Harmonizing means to work together seamlessly and really, really well. What number 4 also points to is the idea that at this point, a number of nations had learned that they had to work together after World War II to solve problems, and that having a formal structure and a place to do that in a way in which they could do that was very, very structured and made a lot of sense and was purposeful was better than sort of doing it haphazardly. Now that we know why the United Nations was created and what it was supposed to do, especially given the context of World War II, which was absolutely horrific and included the Holocaust, which was a mass genocide of Jews. The idea was that we would never have something like that happen again, and that there would be an international body of people watching to make sure that that never happened again, that there would be international law and a group that was able to uphold that international law to check and make sure that nothing like that ever happened again. Now that we understand that, we can talk about how the United Nations is supposed to work and how it actually works. There are a number of subgroups, so smaller groups within the United Nations, but the one you hear about most frequently is called the United Nations Security Council, or the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is one of 6 different bodies within the UN, and it's the one charged with upholding principle number 1, arguably the most core principle of the UN Charter, which is maintaining international safety. The UN Security Council is the body that can approve military action on behalf of the UN. They're also the body that can approve sanctions. Sanctions are when a country has done something that the UN deems to be wrong, and then so there's some sort of punishment. The UN Security Council is the body that deals with that. And the UN Security Council is the body that authorizes any peacekeeping operations. So if the UN sends forces, or if individual countries within the UN sends forces as a part of a United Nations peacekeeping mission in a country, the Security Council is the group within the UN that authorizes and approves that action. At any given time, the UN Security Council has 15 members, but there are a ton more countries within the United Nations. There are actually 193 of the 195 nations around the world are a part of the UN, but there are only 15 countries that are a part of the Security Council at any given time. 5 of those are members that are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And those are the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France. Those are always a part of the Security Council. The other 10 slots rotate through other countries that are voted on 2-year terms. So other countries get the opportunity to be a part of the Security Council for a 2-year term, and that is voted on by the UN General Assembly, which is everyone together. What's important to know about the Security Council is that everyone gets a vote on the UN Security Council, but only those 5 permanent members, remember that's us, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia, they all get a veto. A veto is when you get to vote no on something and then it's dead. It's like, absolutely not. All 5 of those countries get a veto, and they're likely to use that veto if a proposed action is going to hurt them in any way, right? And so while everyone gets a vote, and those votes are all held equally, those 5 are the only 5 that get a veto. And when one of those 5 countries vetoes something, that means that action can't happen by the UN. So you can see how the veto process could get in the way if a proposed action was a really, really great idea, or if many people thought it was a really great idea, but one of those 5 countries decided that it couldn't happen within the UN, then it can't. While the UN doesn't have its own military to enforce whatever decisions they make around the world, they do have what are called United Nations peacekeepers. And United Nations peacekeepers are military forces that are voluntarily provided by the member nations of the UN. So the member nations of the UN voluntarily provide folks to be a part of a force that's like a military for the United Nations. And that military is not meant for war like other military forces are. They are meant specifically to help keep peace, because that is the core mission of the United Nations. One of the other branches of the United Nations is called the General Assembly. You can sort of think of that as the Congress of the UN. It's where everyone comes together and votes on things like the budget, who will be a part of the Security Council, and any other matters that come up before the UN. The third body of the United Nations is called the Economic and Social Council. This group oversees any economic issues. They also work very, very closely with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The fourth body is the International Court of Justice. This is, as the title says, an international court, and this is where a lot of international law comes from. It has representatives from a number of the member nations of the United Nations, and it considers issues where law has been broken, or law has potentially been broken internationally. The fifth body is the United Nations Secretariat. You can think of the Secretariat as sort of the administrative branch of the United Nations. It sets the agenda for what the United Nations is going to consider in the General Assembly and in other branches, and it keeps everyone on track. And finally, there's the United Nations Trusteeship Council. The trustees were a group of regions of land that after World War I were given up by whoever had colonized them or whoever used to rule those areas of land, and they were taken over by the League of Nations, which again was defunct soon after, and it didn't really work out. And so the United Nations Trusteeship Council was meant to make sure that they were well managed, hopefully into becoming independent nations of their own, and that branch of the United Nations stopped working in 1994 because everything did become a nation of its own. So in theory, the United Nations is great, and in practice, it often is really great, right? The idea of very purposely coming together and working in harmony to keep the peace is an awesome idea, but does it always work out? One of the key ways I think we can be critical thinkers here is when we look back at purposes 3 and 4 of the United Nations Charter and think about some of the language that they use. They use language like freedom, they used language like equal rights, and we know that the United States in 1945 was one of the key authors of this document and one of the nations inputting what they thought was ideal in these documents. But at the same time, we also know from our other videos that the United States had Jim Crow laws still in place and absolutely didn't have equal rights for Black people and other people of color in this country. And so what does it mean to have one of the author nations put down all of these ideals and not even uphold them themselves? And then I think a second great question is, how do you practically enforce them? And I think a lot of that challenge comes from the fact that some of this language is really, really vague. And also it's really easy to disagree on what's happening in any given space, right? We know now because of Plessy versus Ferguson, and if you don't, please make sure that you watch the video on Jim Crow laws. But we understand that the United States was positioning themselves as believing that separate services for Black people and white people in America was very much equal, and that was appropriate, that things could be segregated all day long, and that was equal rights. We know now that that seems ridiculous, but at the time, that's what the United States Supreme Court even was arguing. And so if you think back to that time, right after the Holocaust, during a time when the United States still has Jim Crow laws on the books, and you think about what it would take for a governing body like the United Nations to jump in and solve those problems, there are a lot of challenges in their way of actually being able to do that. One of them being the veto, like we talked about. So if we go back in time, the United Nations could have put something out there and said, you know, the United States has these terrible Jim Crow laws that are oppressing Black people. We're going to go in and stop them. And the United States, because they have one of those 5 permanent votes on the UN Security Council, could have vetoed that action and continued doing whatever we wanted to be doing. For reasons like that, it's really rare that the United Nations actually authorizes military action or peacekeeping missions because it's hard to do. It's hard to get authorization and to get everyone on the same page because people have so many different competing interests. And because at the end of the day, a lot of countries don't want someone coming in and saying, yo, what you're doing is wrong. That doesn't mean that we don't try, though, and that the United Nations doesn't do good work, and that continuing to try to push the United Nations forward isn't worth it. The mission is still definitely worth it. While the UN as a body is still often limited by just the basics of human self-interest and folks wanting to protect themselves and continue to do what they're doing, that doesn't mean that they don't have potential to do great work and that they already haven't done great work. Most fundamentally, the UN provides a place for everyone to come together and to push things forward like human rights as a concept. And without the physical space and the mandate to do that, I don't know that everyone would be as on the same page as we are now. Additionally, the UN provides somewhat of an accountability measure. Because 193 countries have ratified the UN Charter, which means that they've agreed that they want to be a part of the United Nations and uphold the purpose and the values of the United Nations. When folks aren't doing that, there's a core document that everyone has agreed to that people can point to and say, here's why and how you're not doing what we all agreed to, which is very different from saying you're not doing what I think is right. It's saying you're not doing something you agreed to do, and that provides additional potential accountability. So there you have it. The UN's really complicated. It is an attempt to get everyone in the same place, to get everyone on the same page and create some sort of international foundation for peace. Obviously, that is both complicated and difficult, but the attempt is still worthwhile. The UN has existed since 1945 and continues to push forward, and I think it's worth it for you to do additional research to figure out where they have been really successful and where, in your view, they have fallen short. Please let me know if there's anything else that you would like to hear videos on, and we're happy to be supportive here at BGCP. Thanks, everyone. See you later.